The newest podcast covering all aspects of the biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel industries is here. From the experts at Clean Fuels Alliance America, it's the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Authentic conversations uncovering the dynamic benefits of clean, renewable fuels. From enhanced performance and immediate cost savings to lower emissions, positive economic impact, and improved air quality. The benefits keep growing. Bringing you the insights that fuel progress. This is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast with your host, Scott Tremaine.
And welcome. This week, a special Mailbag episode as we answer listener questions with Clean Fuels CEO Donnell Rehagen and Director of Communications Heather Buechter.
Thanks, Scott. And hey, welcome everyone to our very first Mailbag episode of the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. You know, Donnell, we've been asking listeners for the past several weeks and months just to send us questions. And today we're going to be answering those questions along with some of the frequently asked questions that we get hit with a lot at trade shows and different events from really folks inside and outside of the industry.
Well, sounds fun. Been looking forward to this.
Okay, well, we'll start you off with the first one. You're going to answer the very first one. We're going to start out with a question that we got after your podcast with Carrie Fogarty about the Incobrasa story. So when I hear biodiesel, I always hear about soybeans. What's the connection?
Yeah, well, that is a good question because I know we always get associated with, our trade association always gets associated with soybeans really quickly. And so that's the very origins of our trade association and our industry. We were founded by soybean farmers 3 decades ago who are trying to find a valuable use for soybean oil, which is a byproduct of soybean production. So that's how anybody who's been around the industry for very long always associates clean fuels and biodiesel, and now renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel with soybeans and soybean oil.
Yes, an integral part of why we're even here in Jefferson City today.
Exactly, right here in the Midwest.
You know, this question we get hit with a lot on social media, a lot of people, maybe from outside of the industry, but it's a food versus fuel argument is what they hit us with. But we like to say it's food and fuel because really it's not either or. Biodiesel and renewable diesel are really essential to American soybean farmers, like you just mentioned, and food security as well. Improved demand has led to better technology, better farm productivity. Soybean yields have increased 32% since 2002. So I think it's important to remember we're not creating soybeans for fuel, but we're using an excess soybean oil.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that's one of the things we've always been very proud of. And I just mentioned it earlier. We were created to try to find a valuable use for the soybean oil because that's not what soybeans are grown for. Soybeans are grown for feed purposes. They go into the animals and the meat that's being produced, some into food production, of course, as well. But the primary use is the protein for animal feed. And so if we are not finding able and willing markets for the oil portion of those soybeans, that makes it very difficult on farmers to be successful and profitable. So, yeah, we grow soybeans here in the United States to feed animals, and the oil comes into our industry. So what a great fit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the two really do go hand in hand because the more soybean oil that we're seeking, the more demand rises, the more soybean productivity happens. And then all that meal goes into the livestock industry too, which lowers prices. So really it's a win-win all around.
Yeah. And you talked about yield technology. It's just so different today than it was 2 or 3 decades ago when we got started. Farmers are much more productive on an acre of land than they were from a soybean perspective than they were 2 or 3 decades ago. So again, plenty of new opportunities for us. And that's been the main reason why we've been able to grow our industry is because soybean production has grown the way it has as well.
Absolutely. And Jonathan Martin actually spoke a lot about this in episode 2 of the Better Cleaner Now podcast.
Yes.
So for those of you listening and want to find out more, go back. You can actually listen to all of our episodes, but specifically on food and fuel, there's some good tidbits in episode 2. So Donnell, another question we had after the episode, Rail Industry on Track to Lower Emissions. What is sparking the interest in switching to biofuels for these new markets?
Yeah, that was Wayne Kennedy and we chatted about that. Wayne's been in the rail industry for decades. And, the thing that's really pushing the rail industry now is much like what's pushing a lot of the rest of corporate America. It's the need to decarbonize for themselves as rail companies, but also decarbonize for their customers. So if you think about all the goods that make their way to our doorsteps or our grocery stores or retail stores, most of that comes at some point is touched by rail. So those customers are asking the railroads, figure out how to help me have a greener footprint in the products I bring to the store shelves or maybe even, to our doorsteps. And so the rail is responding to that and coming to us as a big consumer of liquid fuels to now become a larger consumer of liquid renewable fuels. So pretty excited about that.
Pretty exciting times. And also the marine industry is also emerging too.
The marine industry as well. It's a little more complicated for us here in the United States. Rail obviously is a domestic service. Marine is a little more international. So there's a whole lot of rules around the world about marine operations, not so much so for rail, of course. But yeah, marine is also knocking on our doors about how we can get more of our fuels to their ports.
Exactly. Okay, so Ben wrote us this next question. After listening to the Soy Spotlight with Kansas Soybean Association, he says that he works in transportation decarbonization and has been wondering how biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel can reach net zero. Are there options that the farmers, transporters, crush facility, and biodiesel, renewable diesel plants could take that would lower the CI even further? Has Clean Fuels done any sort of analysis to see what actions could be taken to also realize the tax benefits when using soybeans as the source? So when we talk about CI and a lot of the things that he mentions, I don't know about you, but I think it's an excellent question for Veronica Bradley, our Director of Environmental Science.
That would be great, because my short answer to Ben was going to be yes.
Yes, exactly. But for more detailed, Veronica, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Heather. And I think it's a great question as we've had, the proliferation of CI-based programs. The questioner asked about, the tax credits and all of that. And that's one of many programs that really think about carbon intensity. And so, I guess the short answer is yes, as Donnell said. But to dive into that a little bit deeper, for soy in particular, one of the things to really keep in mind is that we're starting from a lower direct carbon intensity for soy than, say, corn or other oil seeds like canola, because we don't really use nitrogen fertilizer. And nitrogen will turn into this really gnarly greenhouse gas called nitrous oxide that is nearly 3 times as potent of a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So we're really starting in a better place. And so fixing that is a little bit trickier because it's not, the simple solution of different fertilizers or less fertilizers. It's really because soy as a nitrogen fixing plant puts off that nitrous oxide, that N2O emission. And so we're doing some research and partnering with other QSSBs and others to look at what kind of land management practices can really help reduce those emissions in particular, and in light of the different agronomic conditions that occur across the range of soybean plants. So, it kind of depends on the moisture of soil, for example. And so, you're going to have different answers for different regions of the country, but really important aspect there. I think the other part that folks don't really know the gravity of, I guess, at this point, potentially, is that a lot of these CI programs consider this tricky little penalty value of indirect land use change, or ILUC. And that value is not anything that U.S. farmers can really do anything about. It's not about, and it's really not even about U.S. farmers generally or their practices. It's really a problem of having a global commodity that trades and is linked to things like soy from South America, where you have problematic deforestation that kind of ebbs and flows with different political whims of the country's leaders there, and the links through kind of substitution and otherwise of palm oil in Southeast Asia that has, notoriously had similar issues of deforestation. And so, the idea of ILUC is really, if you divert oil to fuel production and all the other demand for the oil stays the same, you're going to need to produce more, leading to extensification, and for these problematic areas, that may be extensification in places that were, precious lands for sequestering carbon, like peatlands in Southeast Asia or rainforest in South America. And one of the modeling that goes into figuring out these values that we see in California's low carbon fuel standard, that we've seen in the most recent tax credit guidance on SAF for the 40B blenders tax credit, and otherwise is this modeling that cannot be verified, but is nevertheless part of that final CI score. And it really kind of, because it can't be verified and can't be proven or disproven in the field, it leads to kind of this circular logic where you have beliefs and judgments and the way you kind of understand or don't understand agriculture, influencing how you feel about the likelihood that these values are true or important. And so, from my perspective, as someone who didn't grow up in agriculture and has learned so much over the last few years at Clean Fuels, I think the modeling and the notions around ILUC kind of misunderstand agriculture. And certainly agriculture's drive for yield improvement and maximizing output while minimizing input, right? And land is an input there, right? And it really misses the time element involved in crop rotation. But some of the models have gotten better over time and are getting better at capturing some of those unique attributes of agriculture in this conversation. For example, California has relied on some modeling that's pretty stale at this point. They haven't updated their values since 2016, and that value for soy in California around ILUC is about half the CI score, whereas the 40B tax credit uses the same models but updated versions, and the value is about a third of soy SAF total CI score. So you're seeing, reductions in the modeling that suggest that the more we know about how agriculture responds to demand, the less this concern is apparent in the modeling. And I think it's a really big issue that it needs to overcome to get to that net zero value, because we've even seen beyond the modeling that, leading experts thinking about internationally policy and how you drive sustainable biofuels, qualitative assessments about concerns, because this value is trying to assign a penalty to avoid this risk of land conversion. And so a qualitative assessment is really better than just doing overly complicated modeling to suggest that there is an actual number and an actual value that soy should be dinged for driving land use change. But the biggest hurdle in all of that really is the political will to suggest that what the modeling shows, what programs have been in place that have used this really need to change and reflect kind of what we know to be true today. So that's kind of the soy specific aspects. And other parts of the supply chain are certainly available to help reduce CI as well. So if we think about, I guess, at the crush phase, using more renewable energy to do the crushing will help reduce the CI score. And I know that we're waiting on some really great data there on the latest information from crush facilities as they've modernized to incorporate that into the modeling and see how much better the CI score for soy gets. And then, of course, the fuel production phase, the more we use, again, renewable energy and other renewable inputs like renewable methanol and renewable hydrogen, we can push down, again, the CI for biodiesel and renewable diesel and SAF. And at that point, when it comes to methanol and hydrogen, it's really about the cost and availability, because those are new kind of nascent markets in their own right. But there's a lot of interest and synergy that can happen with using methanol, green methanol in marine, in addition to our fuels, or green hydrogen transportation in addition to our fuels, and having kind of those multiple markets for those products can also help reduce the cost for our fuel producers to be able to reduce their own CI with those renewable inputs. And then, of course, lastly, transportation throughout the supply chain for us is the last piece of that CI score. So, whether it's electric or running on our fuels throughout the supply chain, throughout the transportation network, that also will lead to lower CI. So there's a lot of opportunity with soy kind of starting at a lower baseline. Some of that opportunity is trickier, but we certainly have a lot of faith in the ability to get to that net zero.
A lot of different elements at play with CI scores that you might not necessarily think about. But of course, a lot of work also going on behind the scenes to lower the CI score for soybeans.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got opportunity and the drive across, the entire economy to decarbonize. And so all of those aspects will come together to help improve our fuel, and then our fuel can help improve everyone else.
I thought it was really a great podcast that you hosted with Sharon Bard with Terra Economics as well, just about how climate smart agriculture can play into that as well, and how the USDA is looking at, feedback right now to incorporate, farmers' perspectives on the different regions and how that applies to lowering CI scores, and just how climate smart ag is different for different regions within the United States too.
Yeah, and I think that is particularly important for soy, kind of as I mentioned, because soy is a nitrogen fixing plant. It puts off those gnarly greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide, that are really going to be managed through practices and potentially genetics. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I know anything about that, but at least on the practices side, there's going to be potential incentive if we get more acknowledgement of climate smart ag in CI scoring that can help move the needle there.
All right, Veronica, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Heather, you were exactly right. Veronica was the right person to answer that question.
Absolutely. I think you can really get bogged down with how much information can come at you with CI scores, but Veronica's doing a great job. And I always reference this when we were at one of our membership meetings. Someone said, well, I don't know exactly what she said, but I sure am glad she is on our side. And we are too, because she does do a lot of work behind the scenes that will really play an integral part in lowering that CI score.
Well, carbon intensity, not just for our industry, but we've been talking about farming, is becoming the one of the number one kind of issues. And so the more we can develop that understanding and participate in the decision making that's going on around that space is going to be great for our industry.
Absolutely.
All right, so Heather, I'm going to take the next question here from one of our listeners, and this one's actually going to go for Scott Fenwick, who's our technical director here at Clean Fuels. And
good afternoon.
So, Scott, the question comes in, and this is a very, very important question. We hear it a lot as well. What's the difference between biodiesel and renewable diesel?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in spite of what you might see and read in the media and press releases, we want to make sure everybody understands that biodiesel and renewable diesel are two separately distinct fuels. They have different ASTM specifications. They have different pros and cons, different ways that they perform in a compression ignition or diesel engine. Biodiesel is more commonly referred to as a fatty acid methyl ester that you might hear that referred to, or FAME. And that means it's an oxygenated molecule. That oxygen in the biodiesel molecule is what gives biodiesel its superior benefits from emissions, lower reduced particulate matter emissions, lower CO2 and life cycle emissions, and that extra lubricity needed in today's high-pressure common rail engines. Renewable diesel is produced more like a petroleum fuel is in what would be referred to as a traditional refinery with hydrotreating capabilities. There are petroleum processes referred to as hydrotreating, hydrocracking, where they actually replace the oxygen in those molecules with hydrogen. So what you end up with is a fuel that is practically indistinguishable from a petroleum hydrocarbon or a petroleum fuel, and that the only way to distinguish them once they're blended with a petroleum fuel is through carbon dating.
Okay, so Scott, let me follow up then with another question that we've received. So when you're talking about the quality of biodiesel, does biodiesel perform consistently during all seasons of the year?
Yeah, there are a lot of people that believe that biodiesel is a seasonal fuel and that in winter or cold weather operability conditions, you must either eliminate biodiesel from the fuel or significantly reduce its concentration. We don't believe that. Every fuel has its challenges. Even a petroleum distillate fuel can gel in cold weather operability conditions. And so there is some care and concern that must be taken, but there are solutions out there. And so we see a lot of fleets using B20, even higher blends. We've talked on previous episodes about Pepsi using B100. They do that throughout the year in spite of the cold weather challenges, whether that's in Wisconsin or in Kansas for 12 months out of the year. And so there are fuel additives available in the marketplace. There are means to store your vehicles or your equipment indoors to kind of mitigate the cold weather performance. And then there are also heated tanks, heated fuel lines, and ways that we can mitigate cold weather performance. But again, not just of biodiesel blends, but of distillate fuels in general. So yes, biodiesel can be used in all types of weather conditions.
All right, Scott. And then the last question I have for you, and you're going to love this one because we talk about this a lot, don't we? A listener's asking, can biodiesel or using renewable diesel, can using biodiesel or renewable diesel void my warranty?
That is a really good question. The warranty issue comes up time and time again. And so we want to be very clear about this issue. For on and off-road applications, whether those are ag or construction equipment or those 18-wheelers you see rolling up and down the interstates, warranties on those engines cover parts and workmanship. So if there was a defect in the manufacturing process or by chance they were assembled incorrectly or something was wrong with manufacturing, that's what's covered under warranty. Warranties in those applications do not cover fuels. And what's interesting about that statement is there's no mention of the word biodiesel even at all. So if a problem arises in on and off-road applications that is specifically due to the fuel, no matter whether it's B0 or B100 or anything in between, that's not covered by warranty. And so that's really important because we are seeing more and more states and incentives across the country that are incentivizing higher and higher blends. Whether it's a fleet wanting to go and improve upon their carbon reduction goals, whether it's a state incentive like Iowa that's advocating for B30, know that you can use those higher blends without voiding any engine warranties.
Yeah, I think that's a common misconception, and a question that we often get is just, do higher blends void my warranty? So always good to hear from Scott Fenwick.
You got that right. And as Scott talks about all the time, I mean, we have such a high quality of biodiesel and renewable diesel in the marketplace. All the studies that we look at proves that year in and year out. And so I don't think that's anything for consumers to have to worry about.
You're listening to the Better, Cleaner Now podcast.
I'm Heather Buechter, back with the CEO of Clean Fuels, Donnell Rehagen. And Donnell, our next question, we are going to bring in one of our program managers, the Director of State Governmental Affairs, Jeff Earl, because this has to do with the low carbon fuel standard in California. And Michael says that he listened to the podcast on the LCFS and has heard about this veg oil cap that CARB recently proposed. So, Jeff, our question for you is, what are your concerns about how this cap might shift demand for soybean oil in California and other states? And What are Clean Fuels' comments to CARB regarding this?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Thanks for the question, Michael. Definitely a concern when CARB released their 15-day package the other week to bring back the cap on veg oils. We had been working with CARB for over a year now on this issue. They originally had proposed a veg oil cap. We did a lot of work, a lot of discussion with them. This was led by Floyd Vergara, who was the role I currently have previous to me. He really took that and led the discussions with CARB along with Alan Weber and someone else that we work closely with to get them off a veg oil cap and to show them that that would hinder the availability of biofuels in California. We all know that biofuels have been very successful. Biodiesel, renewable diesel, and the decarbonizing the transportation sector in California. And so when we saw the veg oil caps reappear, it was definitely a concern for us. We think it's going to limit the amount of biofuels that are going to be able to generate credits and be part of that market, and it's only going to dampen the success and keep biofuels from being able to achieve what CARB is ultimately looking at, and that is to decarbonize the transportation sector there. And so we'll be putting our comments together. Corey and Wynn on our team, our state regulatory affairs director out there on the West Coast, will be leading that. We'll be talking with all of our stakeholders, our members, our member producers, our ag stakeholders to understand it, because there's other things in there as well, too, that we will be commenting on. But the veg oil cap is obviously of highest concern for us right now, and trying to understand why that reappeared and came back. So we'll be working with our membership, put those comments together. I know others in our membership will be doing comments on their own, and we encourage them to do so. But we'll be pushing back on that hard, adding some data and some analysis to it, and hopefully to get CARB to understand that these limitations and barriers that they've placed on soy-based feedstocks is really only going to hurt them in the end.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. We really appreciate it, and really good to see the insight, because these LCFS programs really do drive a lot of demand. Oh,
it's the number one driver, really. If you think about how much of our fuel, we're 74% of the diesel pool in California, the LCFS is the driver for that. We see a lot of other states looking at implementing some form of an LCFS policy. So what's happening in California and what's happening with the LCFS is critically important to our industry.
Yeah, we're all watching.
Yeah. Okay, so hey, Heather, I'm going to toss a question over to Jonathan Martin. Jonathan is our Director of Economics and our Market Analytics, and keeps an eye on everything that's going on, not just here in the United States, but really around the world when it talks about energy, because we're all so much tied in here in the United States with energy production, not just for here in the United States, but all around the world. Yeah. So Jonathan, the question comes in and it says that demand is rising for our cleaner fuels. Mm-hmm. Is there enough available feedstock to meet the growing demand?
Thank you, Donnell. Clean fuels are certainly in very high demand right now, and we've seen demand for our fuels surging in recent years. Before 2010, there was very little to no consumption of biomass-based diesel. Consumption of clean fuels grew somewhat quickly to around 2.7 billion gallons by 2016, and then demand for clean fuels stagnated there for quite a few years, until the renewable diesel boom, which happened in the early 2020s, following COVID. Per EPA EMTS data, consumption of biomass-based diesel and sustainable aviation fuel was around 4.6 billion gallons last year in 2023, and through July this year, consumption has been around 2.9 billion gallons so far, which is quite significant and is forecast growth again continuing. These are just consumption figures for the United States, but as we all know, demand for clean fuels has been surging outside the U.S. and other markets, such as Canada, Europe, and Asia as well. That can be a topic for another day.
Yeah, and a lot of that demand is increased interest, really from multiple industries.
Yeah, we've been hearing a lot from different industries, such as one of our partners, PepsiCo, is a good example of this, is the trucking industry on road. And so they have one of the largest fleets, and they've been consuming a lot of biomass-based diesel, and they plan to continue to grow that. We're also hearing a lot from the rail industry, from a couple of our other members, such as Union Pacific and Canadian Pacific Kansas City. and also in the marine industry, in the maritime industry. There's a lot of demand. We're seeing a lot of growth in Europe and in Asia, and so that's a very interesting path. This is great news for our producer members, and it's also great for the environment. Everyone is very interested in clean fuels for their futures, and the future does look very bright. So
the future is bright, but a little nuanced as well.
Yeah, I'm going to try to step back into my economics role here for a little bit, and I'll apologize. I'm kind of a Debbie Downer here when it comes to that. Most of us economists are not typically the first people invited to any parties or anything, and there's a reason for that. So let me make this very clear. Domestic market demand for clean fuels is set by the Renewable Fuel Standard and the blending mandates that are set forward by the EPA as part of the RFS. These mandates are called Renewable Volume Obligations, or RVOs. Feedstock costs for biomass-based diesel and sustainable aviation fuel are much higher than those for their main competitor in the market, namely petroleum diesel fuel. So this hurdle is very hard to clear for producers, and due to this simple fact, biomass-based diesel tends to be more expensive to produce than petroleum diesel. The RFS provides a credit to try to offset the increased costs associated with blending clean fuels into petroleum fuels, and most market participants are unwilling to pay for clean fuels that are more expensive than petroleum diesel. So the demand upside for the market is directly tied to what the EPA sets the RVOs at. This is why we at Clean Fuels have been very critical of the EPA in their recent release, as we feel that they greatly undershot on their RVO assessment for biomass-based diesel.
Yeah, so we're really advocating for higher RVOs at this point, and that all circles kind of back around to the feedstocks and our partnership with the soybean world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is good to try to get back to the original question from Donnell. I apologize. So there are enough feedstocks to meet domestic demand for clean fuels. And the future outlook is really going to depend on what the EPA sets the RVOs at starting in 2026 and later. Historically, vegetable oils, especially soybean oil, have been the foundation for the clean fuels industry. I think Donnell discussed that earlier in the podcast. With growth in the market in recent years and with the low carbon fuel standards being implemented in different states along the West Coast, feedstocks with really low carbon intensity scores are preferred to feedstocks with higher CI scores. This has driven a lot of demand for low CI feedstocks such as distillers corn oil, used cooking oil, and inedible tallow. Markets have responded, and we have seen large trade flows from overseas in order to meet market demands for low CI biomass-based diesel. Overall, this is a great thing. We are openly trading with relatively free markets with other countries that take their wastes and convert them to usable clean fuels here in the U.S. Does this mean that vegetable oils have been pushed out of the market? No, it does not mean that. We have still seen record usage of vegetable oils as feedstocks to the biomass-based diesel process. For example, over 13 billion pounds of soybean oil was used last year by U.S. clean fuels producers, setting a clear record above the previous record, which was the year before in 2022, which was only 10.5 billion pounds. That's still a lot, but we're at over 13, which is over 1 billion pounds a month. I expect usage of soybean oil to remain strong throughout 2024 and into 2025 in biomass-based diesel processing, as it is the marginal feedstock. USDA agrees with me, and in their recently released WASDE report, they have soybean crush at record levels near their capacity, with soybean crush capacity continuing to come online over the next few years, and this will help the biomass-based diesel industry continue to grow and meet market demands.
Well, and hey, thanks, Jonathan, for that. I mean, that kind of really brings us almost back to where we started with this episode. Heather, talking about feedstocks, we started talking about soybeans and the role of soybeans. Why do they always hear about soybeans when they talk about our fuels? But now we're talking about multiple feedstocks, and soybeans being the primary one, soybean oil being the primary one, of course. But now we're seeing canola, we're seeing animal fats and used cooking oil, distillers corn oil. I mean, it's a pretty exciting time for us to see the growth potential that we have, because we have all of these feedstocks in the volume that we have them to allow our industry to grow. As you know, our industry's goal is to be 6 billion gallons by 2030. A little inside secret, we're probably going to hit 5 billion gallons this year.
We are well on our way.
And we would not be able to do that if we didn't have all of these feedstocks. And so exciting times for our industry. So this has been fun.
It's an exciting time for our industry. And also, we just really appreciate all the questions, too.
Yeah.
And for our listeners out there, keep the questions coming. This is our very first Mailbag episode. We anticipate to have more.
Yeah, that would be great.
All right, Donnell, thanks for hosting with me, and thank you for listening.
All right. Well, thank you, Heather, Donnell, and all of our experts. That's it for this week's episode. What a fun episode. If you enjoy the podcast and you've got a moment, it really does help us if you give us a rating. It helps the show grow and get higher up on the lists. And if you really want to go for it, just leave us a review. We might just read it here. So please do that wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you've got a question for our experts for a future Mailbag episode, or a suggestion for a future topic or guest, you can always email us at podcasts@cleanfuels.org. And join us next week for another episode of the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. To catch all the latest from Clean Fuels Alliance America, follow us at cleanfuels.org. The Better, Cleaner, Now podcast is a production of Clean Fuels Alliance America. That's all for us. Now it's your turn to be better, cleaner, now.